Hello, and good afternoon. I'm Walaa Bakry, a principal lecturer in international project management and finance. I'm here today from the PM Radio Westminster, broadcasting from London. It is actually my pleasure to interview our internationally renowned guest, Professor Nadine Ibrahim from the University of Waterloo, Canada. But perhaps first, let's hear some of our latest news, which were collected, prepared, and edited by our PM Radio editor, Carla Roche. But I must say here that Carla is an alumni of our popular master program in project management. Okay. We probably have all heard of the effort to refloat the wedged container ship Ever Given in the Suez Canal, which was succeeded on Monday, to the delight of many Egyptians and the international trade community. The Ever Given is a giant container ship the size of 4 football pitches. It was stuck across Egypt's Suez Canal for almost a week, after which attempts to dislodge it succeeded on Monday morning. The giant ship is 400-meter long, almost as long as Manhattan Empire State Building, and weighs 200,000 tons. It got stuck on the morning of Tuesday, the 23rd of March. Amid reported high winds and sandstorm, blocking one of the most important international trade arteries. By Monday morning, there were more than 300 ships stuck on either side of the canal, and some vessels had to reroute around Africa. Almost 12% of global trade passes through the 120-mile canal, which connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, providing the shortest sea link between Asia and Europe. According to data from Lloyd's List, the blockage was holding up estimated $9.6 billion, almost 7 billion pounds of goods each day, or $400 million a day, or an hour, sorry. The effort of the Suez Canal Authority, with the assistance from the Dutch salvage firm Boskalis, hired to help to refloat the ship, succeeded on Monday morning when the tide was at its highest. The crisis has ignited interest in sustainable international supply chain management. Perhaps now we can move to some of other news closer to home. The UK is to launch its first green savings bonds to boost its climate credentials. The UK will launch its first sovereign green savings bonds, offering retail investors the chance to buy into projects dedicated to greening the economy, such as renewable energy schemes. The awards of the bonds were broadcast virtually for the first time in their history. The UK Treasury also said that funds from the saving bonds would be earmarked for schemes to help the UK initiatives build back greener and meet its target of net zero greenhouse emission by 2050. Separately, the UK Treasury said that the Chancellor would launch 3 competitions to develop new technologies to help meet the net zero goal. These will include a £20 million competition to develop floating offshore wind projects, £70 million to design a system to store excess low-carbon energy, and £4 million to find ways of boosting clean energy crops and forestry. Closer to our profession, 2021 is the International Year of Responsible Project Management, the APM has announced. Barely 18 months elapsed since the launch of the Manifesto of Responsible Project Management in July 2018. The RPM movement began with signatories to a manifesto expressed as a statement of purpose and a set of principles. The wording of the RPM manifesto was developed in real time during a 2-day workshop that brought together educators, practitioners, and researchers. By the end of the workshop, a consensus emerged and 20 professionals signed the manifesto. The APM, our Association of Project Management, was among the first signatories, as well as the Association of Sustainability Practitioners, which helped to shape the development of its ideas. 18 months on, the signatories now include a global construction company, 2 professional bodies, and 144 individuals from 29 universities and 28 companies around the world. Balancing the needs of people, planet, and prosperity, last summer, the APM submitted evidence to the House of Commons Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, suggesting that the UK government should focus on responsible project management. The Select Committee in July report titled Delivering Government's Infrastructure Commitments Through Major Projects gave the definition used in the 2019 Guide to Responsible Project Management. The RPM group states that behaving professionally means accepting responsibility for the impact of one's actions and the long-term consequences for stakeholders and wider society. If there is any doubt that greater awareness is needed, then the Grenfell Tower disaster provides evidence that project professionals may be called to account for their decisions long after the end of a project. Still in the UK Ministry of Defence announced the winner of its 2020 Sanctuary Awards. The long-running awards, which are organized by the Defence Infrastructure Organization, have showcased the best military and civilian conservation effort from across the MOD state for nearly 30 years. The awards highlight the MOD commitment to making defense more environmentally friendly and sustainable, both in the UK and overseas. The MOD Annual Sanctuary Award showcased projects to reduce plastic waste, conserve rare species, restore heritage assets, reduce emissions, and save electricity. The award categories for projects were environmental protection and enhancement, social value, community and heritage, sustainable construction, energy, low carbon and resource efficiency, sustainable procurement, and finally, individual achievement. And now, perhaps closer to Nadine's home, governments of Canada and Alberta invest in projects to support communities to improve the quality and sustainability of public facilities. Funding for 61 infrastructure projects were announced to provide communities with safe, comfortable, and sustainable public infrastructure and increase active transportation options, while supporting economic recovery in the region by providing jobs and business opportunities to communities in Alberta. Through the Investing in Canada plan, the federal government is investing more than $180 billion over 12 years in public transit projects, green infrastructure, social infrastructure, trade and transportation routes, as well as Canada's rural and northern communities. On this note, perhaps it is my pleasure to welcome our guest, Professor Nadine Ibrahim, to the studio and to tell us more about sustainability and project management. Professor Nadine Ibrahim is Hello, Nadine. Professor Nadine Ibrahim is the Turkstra Chair in Urban Engineering. She lectures in the Department of Civil Engineering and Environmental Engineering at the University of Waterloo. She holds a BSc, an MSc, and a PhD in Civil Engineering and has a certificate of Preventive Engineering and Social Development, an exciting title, from the University of Toronto. She is also, which is more important, a project management professional at PMP. So she is really one of us, and she has been certified since 2010. Her experience covers wide areas of relevant projects to sustainability and project management, from economics, urban governance, public policy, and climate science. Nadine's international experience covers not only Canada, but also the Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Sahara Africa. She worked in international development on large-scale projects for clients, including the World Bank and United Nations Development Program. She has experience in the areas of sustainable cities and sustainable development. Nadine chairs the Special Interest Group on the Engineering of 2050 at the Canadian Engineering Education Association. She's an educator, and sits on the Pan-Canadian Advisory Committee of the Canadian Engineering Grand Challenges. Believe me, Nadine's bio is much longer than that. But Nadine, it is a genuine pleasure to have you with us today. Hello, Nadine.
Hi, Walaa.
Nadine, perhaps I should start by asking you a very traditional British warming up questions. How's the weather in Canada?
Oh, it's actually surprisingly gray. I'd like to say it was sunny, but it was only sunny yesterday. But maybe I could say not as gray as on your side.
Well, it is not actually that bad here today either. A little bit cloudy, but we can't complain. So, and actually we were allowed out yesterday. I don't know if you know that. Actually Monday, sorry. So we can meet 5 other people outside. But Nadine, I know you're a great expert, and it is really, first I would really like to thank you on behalf of my colleagues and all our audience for agreeing to be interviewed and appear on PM Radio today. But maybe, you know, it's almost impossible to escape a news item or a newspaper or any talk without seeing or coming across or hearing the word sustainability. Maybe we can start with a very simple question. What is sustainability, Nadine?
All right, that's a good start. And it's always a good day to talk about sustainability. And I want to thank you very much for inviting me to be on this episode of your PM Radio. So it's always a question that's asked. And if you ask anybody, they'll have a definition of their own. So there's almost as many definitions as there are people that you would ask. And just sifting through all the definitions that you could find, I think sometimes it's nice to take a step back and try to define it by what it is not. Because sometimes it's easier to identify when you don't spot sustainability. So for example, when things go wrong, it's easy for us to point a finger and say, well, this is global warming, here's biodiversity loss, here's sea level rise, here's land use changes. It's a little bit harder to point when things are going well, which is when you have sustainability. So I think sustainability, with the many definitions, the one that's closest to the sustainability community is the one by the Brundtland Commission, which was first mentioned in Our Common Future. And this implies that sustainability is for now, for the present and the future, for all of humanity, and so that we could use resources slower, not faster, then the environment could replenish and regenerate. So I think even among all the many definitions, there are common themes, and the themes are always present and future. There's an ethical dimension always present in some of these definitions, but also the ability to include everybody. It's inclusive of low income, high income, developed world, developing world, men and women, children and older adults, etc.
Okay, that's an excellent definition, actually, Nadine. Now you've made it sound so exciting for us, but okay, so why incorporating sustainability in international projects, for example, is important? I mean, how would I go to someone's boss and say it is really important to have a KPI in an international project about sustainability?
Well, of course, as a practitioner, I'd say, of course, it's important, but there's always this aspect of convincing others that it's also important. So I would say that it is always important because it means different things to different people. And you have to find a common ground when you incorporate sustainability so that you incentivize thinking about it with other people that are also involved. So I'm just going to sort of preface this by saying that my angle into project management and sustainability really comes from parts of the world where I was engaged in. So I worked a little bit between my degrees here, and part of my work was in international development between my master's and my PhD, when I was based out of Cairo in Egypt and working in environmental consulting and international development in that part of the world. And so really tackling projects in the Middle East and North Africa region. And so that's sort of my lens into international projects that way. And then there were some other projects that I did in my role as a postdoctoral fellow where I worked in sub-Saharan Africa, and of course more project management on this side of the Atlantic on Canadian projects. And sustainability means different things. In Canada, sustainability means aging infrastructure and trying to rehabilitate that and trying to make these decisions. Do you repair or do you replace? Do you have the funds to do that? But sustainability in other parts of the world, perhaps impoverished or low income areas, might actually mean just supplying basic services like waste management or water supply. So that's why I think it is important to recognize that because most people, companies, countries are at a different state of sustainability. Some are just starting off, some are pretty advanced. And so where you start off is also important, but it's important to put that sustainability lens on, because then it gives you a different view of projects. It might not be only the cost of a project or the duration of a project. Now you could also look at it from a sustainability perspective to see the longevity of how feasible it is.
It's really exciting. I didn't want to stop your flow of exciting wave describing the importance of sustainability in international projects. But actually, excuse me, you've just pointed to your experience on North America, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Culture, or we talk about cultural impact, cultural factors in managing international projects. Did you actually find perhaps that the culture itself has a context or a lens or a dimension to sustainability or projects that has an element of sustainability in it? Let's start perhaps by the African continent. Did you spot a difference maybe between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa? Absolutely.
I mean, if we're talking about culture, well, the social aspect of it is one of the pillars of sustainability. So just as a reminder, sustainability is the economic dimension, the social dimension, and the environmental dimension. So culture definitely fits into the social part of it. And I would say that if, going into a project, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, I always say, I'm African born because I was born in Egypt, but I don't understand much of the culture in the various countries. Africa is not homogenous. Every city, every country has its own traditions, has its own culture. And so because you mentioned culture, it's so important for a project manager to recognize the differences so that they could be successful in implementing what they need, so that they can bring the people that need to be at the table. So I think the value of local knowledge, the value of that local context is ever important, especially in this globalized world that we live in, made even more global because of the current times that we live in as well.
Again, it's really fascinating, and you just emphasized the points that we always talk to our students about in kind of theoretical kind of way about the importance of cultural context, etc. But you just mentioned something else, which is bringing in the people. And I'm sure you're aware that the concept of the public as a stakeholder, particularly in large projects or international project, was there a different way, or do you think it is particularly important that the public or the people, the stakeholders that are actually potential users among the public are engaged or being engaged with those projects?
Stakeholder management, stakeholder expectations is equally as important as client expectations. So I think when it comes to stakeholders, inviting more people to be at the table, it always makes for more voices at the table, which always makes for a better project because everybody is taken into consideration. But I think what's critical here is not to bring these stakeholders once the plans are all made, but to actually engage them early on in a participatory approach so that early on their voices are heard, their opinions are made clear, and it could be incorporated into the plan. It's so much more difficult to make changes after the fact than to have it incorporated earlier on. And I think when we're talking about stakeholders, not everybody is actually able to be at the table, at the decision-making table. And I think pointing to one of your news pieces that you mentioned earlier about projects in rural and northern communities in Canada, well, that's the Indigenous community population that we have here. And sometimes they're not always able to be at the decision-making table for various reasons. So sometimes recognizing also who is not at the table and making sure that their opinions and their voices are represented as well is good stakeholder management.
Again, so you've just covered now stakeholders, you've covered culture, and now you're bringing us to the idea of communication and the importance of communicating with the various stakeholders within an international project. But can I just say, okay, if one is an international project manager or a project manager, is there anything in particular that they will need to ensure when they are managing sustainability? So the project itself may not be, or the deliverables, the outputs may not be about sustainability itself, but what about the management of the project itself? Is there anything in particular that they need to watch out for regarding sustainability?
Oh, they need to watch out for a lot of things, because sustainability just adds more and more layers. But even if the project is not necessarily sustainability related, but needs to factor in some of these sustainability concepts. I'll draw an example here from my experience in international development when based in the Middle East and North Africa region, where oftentimes we would find that projects are financed by various organizations. So specifically in Egypt, for example, it's a very fertile place to receive a lot of financial assistance from international donor organizations or bilateral organizations. So I was working at a small environmental consulting firm at the time, and part of the financing that was coming, it was coming from the World Bank, was coming from the Global Environment Facility, and some were bilateral, like the Dutch, for example. They funded a lot of water resources projects in the region. The Japanese funded cultural heritage and transportation projects. So every donor organization that is providing financial assistance has a certain way of doing things. They have a certain way of reporting. They have a certain way of engaging local expertise and local consultants, and they also have a way to report on progress and the indicators that are of relevance to them. So I think it's very important for project managers to know all these aspects so that they can engage successfully with those who finance those projects, but also as a way to maintain that local connection, even on international projects. So when you say managing sustainability, I think it's managing all aspects of it, but specifically, you can't have a project unless you have the financing for it. So I think it starts earlier on with engaging that and just managing that financial expectations as well and reporting.
Thank you again. So you've now covered sort of culture, communication, stakeholder management, reporting, and financial management as well. But actually, is there any particular metrics that perhaps we can use to measure sustainability that you would suggest? I'm fascinated by your experience in different continents and Sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa. And maybe, I don't know, but is there perhaps different measures, different KPIs that one would use depending on the region or the culture and so on?
Yes, it's a good question. It's also a question I get asked by my students. So I teach sustainability for second year civil engineering students, and I tell them clearly upfront before the course starts that this course is qualitative and quantitative. That sustainability, it's not a belief, it's not a hope, it's not a wish, it's actually quite measurable. And, if we can if we can measure it, therefore we can manage it. So absolutely, there are metrics and there are ways to measure it. So again, just pointing to the pillars of sustainability, the environmental, social, and economic aspect of it. We can measure sustainability, for example, by how many cars we take off the road and replace that with public transit or clean vehicles or electric vehicles. Or we can measure it in terms of how many liters of fuel, of heating that is replaced by more renewable sources. We can measure it in terms of how much carbon emissions are removed because of a change in technology or a change in implementation. So I think some of these metrics make it easier to compare projects. And if you're putting an economic lens only, you tend to perhaps choose the ones that are only less expensive. But if you're putting a sustainability lens as well, then you may consider cost effectiveness, which may not lead you to smaller upfront capital costs, but may get you looking at the life cycle of products and life cycle of technologies. And that's what incorporates more of that longevity, that longer duration of technologies and projects. So just a few examples of some of those metrics that could be measured.
Sorry. Yeah, well, that's excellent. So you're bringing it back to the triangle, I guess, of sustainability, social, economic, and environmental. But actually, that takes us perhaps to my next questions. Well, okay, is there a cost to sustainability? And also, more importantly, wouldn't poor countries be paying perhaps relatively a higher cost than maybe developed countries to achieve sustainability goals?
I know. And I think this is where, I mean, it's all positive so far, but I think when it comes to a question like that, that's where a little bit of the injustice side of sustainability really comes into play. Cost for sustainability is disproportionately higher for lower income countries than they are for higher income countries, in the same way that carbon emissions, for example, is disproportionately distributed around the world, where the higher income countries are the ones that are really responsible for much of the global emissions, but the lower income countries, they almost produce very little, but climate change impacts are very global. It doesn't matter who's producing it at this point. So that as well becomes disproportionately distributed. So one thing that's sort of a glimmer of hope when it comes to the cost of sustainability being so high for lower income countries is that they have the ability to not follow the same pattern, not follow the same path as the global north followed to develop. So the Western countries or the global north countries, in order for us, and I'm going to say us, I mean, you're in the UK and I'm in Canada, and we went through all the fossil fuel consumption to get to this modernization and industrialization where we are today. And here we are in 2021 asking all other countries to try to be more renewable, to try to be more sustainable, but they don't have the same capacity to do that. A lot of the technologies for renewable energy is still cost prohibitive, which makes it quite expensive for them to include that. But don't they also have a desire to be sustainable? So the glimmer of hope here is they have the ability to leapfrog. And the word leapfrog, I don't know if you know the game leapfrog, where you jump over someone. So sub-Saharan Africa is a prime example of that. A lot of the countries there, for example, they went from no phone to cell phone, completely bypassing the landline. And I think following that same analogy, they could leapfrog many technologies when it comes to having no car to jumping to electric vehicles or to jumping to very innovative public transit. So I think that's what makes it, despite being more cost involved, it is still more sustainable in the long run because of the ability for them to take on such innovations without having to go through the unsustainable steps that we had to go through in the global north. So I think it's an opportune moment for countries to recognize, even if they do fall in the low income category, that there are opportunities to do that. But it's also the responsibility of everybody globally to really help out those that can't afford it, because we are all responsible for even those low income countries that have been unable to ride that wave towards sustainability.
Okay. I have a background in technology, so I'm always interested in the idea of leapfrogging a technology, and let's not go through what people have done in other. I think there's some feedback, but anyway, I'm going to carry on. I don't know where it's coming from. Okay, maybe right. I think it's stopped now. No,
it seems to be very quiet on my end.
Okay, it's your point. Only my end. Okay, so let me ask you another question, which is, okay, well, I agree with you about the idea of leapfrogging a technology, but the cost of the new technology, the latest technology, if you like, the capital investment in the new technology, like electric batteries, for example, factories, etc., it is quite prohibitive for some of those developing countries. Is there, if you like, I don't want to use the word moral responsibility because that sort of takes us to a different domain, but is there perhaps an economic responsibility or a social responsibility? You touched on that a little bit, on the developed countries to actually allow that technology transfer or know-how, at a much faster pace than it is currently being done.
Very good question that sort of touches upon some of the complexities around that. So I think an example from just climate change emissions and mitigation, which is sort of what my area of research is, specifically when it comes to cities. So maybe I'll draw on that example to answer that question. Let's take, for example, a country like Germany implementing waste management. It tends to be very advanced. They might actually recycle their waste 7 ways, but when it comes to implementing waste management projects in a country like Egypt, and I was involved in the on the German fund to do a waste privatization project in Egypt, it's actually almost undoable because of the cost involved, because of the very low starting point where the entire system needs to be rethought and reimagined and changed. But having that comparison between what can take place in Germany and what can take place in Egypt, very small initiatives that could take place in a country like Egypt to improve waste management practices could actually improve the system overall. So for Germany to advance on what it is already doing pretty well in might be even more expensive, but to do these little baby steps in a country like Egypt would improve along the way. So I think when you're talking about how expensive it is, the responsibility here of countries to help out those that can't is actually quite attractive financially as well, because instead of spending money in their own countries to improve upon already great projects and already sustainable initiatives, they can divert this money to finance projects in low-income countries or sort of still developing countries to improve upon that. So when it comes to climate change as well, there's a lot of carbon credits that could be bought, but there's also a mechanism by which, instead of reducing emissions in a country like Germany, for example, they could help improve facilities, manufacturing facilities, technologies, etc., in the developing part of the world to improve emissions there and take those credits as well. So I think there are mechanisms in place to divert these funds from one place to another to help out those that can't afford it very much.
Okay, Nadine, thank you for that again. But actually, just on that, I want to sort of, I'm sorry if I appear to be pressing you on that, but I guess because we have quite a few of our students who come from developing countries, and they feel the need to actually speed up human development. They don't want to go through a traditional cycle of human development, and they think, okay, how can we overcome the obstacles and still remain sustainable? Is it something that may have a local context? Does regional clusters should club together and do something at that kind of level? But if you're a young man or woman or lady, in a developing countries, you don't really want to wait 20 years to, or for them, such a long time, and to not necessarily to be at the same level, but actually to get some development, some human development, to speed up some of their living conditions and yet remain sustainable. I mean, I don't know if you have any reflection on that.
I mean, you're tying human development with sustainability, and I think the good thing is we don't have to choose one over the other. I think having that sustainability perspective in everything that is being done offers that human development without having the need to see it as two sides to the same coin, because one helps the other. And I'll reflect here on the Sustainable Development Goals. So, and just a sort of a 2-minute of history before I can get into that. Right now, we've got the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 goals that are applicable to every country in the world that have signed on to it. And those 17 goals touch upon many aspects of sustainable development globally. And they refer to this year as the decade of action. Between 2020 and 2030 is when a lot of these targets should be met. Now, because it applies to the whole world, human development is possible and is equally applicable to everybody around the world, regardless of their starting point, regardless of how they are categorized in terms of low income, medium, or high income development. Contrasting that to what existed prior to the Sustainable Development Goals. It was referred to as the Millennium Development Goals. And they came about in the early 2000s with a goal of achieving them in 2015, but they were not achieved. A lot of the targets were not met. And the main reason, well, there's probably many reasons, but the main reason was the Millennium Development Goals, which are now defunct and replaced by the Sustainable Development Goals, they were not applicable to everybody. Those targets only spoke to the developing world. And recognizing here the responsibility of everybody to come and to be involved, I think this what gives hope that the Sustainable Development Goals is the way forward because it includes everybody's responsibility. And I think Goal 17 is partnership for sustainability, partnership for the Sustainable Development Goals. So when you mentioned that a lot of your students are from the developing world, and I've certainly lived there for a good part of my life to see what it's like, human development is a big issue that historically some countries are still burdened by a history of challenges. But I think the way forward means they don't need to do it alone. So you mentioned clusters or hubs of countries. And I think, at least from the cities front, there are cities that cluster together to help out. There are regions, sort of the sub-Saharan African region has coalitions, and they've got organizations that help each other out. And of course, you've got the same in North America and or in Europe. And I think it's promising, it's optimistic, but I think maybe I'd want to borrow a terminology here to demonstrate that human development and resource consumption really used to go hand by hand. The more societies are consuming these resources, the more they can grow and develop. But I think we need to break that. So that human development can still be possible without necessarily being this overly consumptive society, like how we are in North America, for example. And so the word here is called decoupling. If you imagine a graph where you've got two lines going together, one is resource consumption and one is human development, and they go hand in hand. Well, what if human development was possible, but resource consumption is going down because we're using less and less and less? And that is possible when you introduce sustainability to this mix, that we could be responsible and sustainable and still continue to see that growth. And I think one of the cities that have already shown this graph to already be splitting is actually London. At least from my city's research, London has shown decoupling taking place, where emissions are now going down, but emissions are going down and resource consumption is going down, but economic prosperity is still on the rise. So I think that is the hope for all cities to follow suit. I think the key one for London here is that congestion charging, particularly how that was able to reduce transportation emissions, provide really good sustainable transit, for example, remove more cars off the road. So I think that ties a little bit of the sustainability angle to it, to human development and economic progress.
Okay, I like the word decoupling, and you're almost sort of telepathic. You're sort of bringing in the congestion charges and the decoupling together. And actually that takes me perhaps to the first point, the first item of our news, which is the Ever Given ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal, and that resulted in lots of people talking about perhaps we need to revisit the international supply chain and make it more sustainable. Some of the suggestions perhaps were talked about is to actually bring the manufacturing of some of the things that we consume in the West a bit closer to home. Now, that may benefit some countries where, I don't know, if they move them to a bit closer to some northern African countries, so that will benefit those countries. Maybe some Eastern European countries, where the supply chain perhaps is a little bit more secure, and so on. But that will actually may result in taking some of those jobs from some other countries. So you will create some kind of tension. I know this is sort of a new thing, but I don't know if you had a chance to, or if you've come across some kind of debate about these ideas of revisiting the international supply chain.
Well, certainly, the Suez Canal disaster, but then it had a happy ending, was front and center in global news all of last week, and I was following it because I'm from there, so always keeping an eye out. I think COVID first gave us insight into how disruptive it could be to supply chains. I remember ordering Lego bricks for an activity that I was doing for my course for urban planning and city building, and my shipment was delayed. This is before the pandemic was declared. And so that was an indication that something like a pandemic could disrupt shipping channels and supply chains. So I think the Suez Canal gave us another opportunity to take a look at that. But you also mentioned sustainability. Are there more sustainable ways? So sustainability for shipping, I think the Suez Canal is great. It reduces travel from months, around the Cape of Africa into a much shorter duration. So I equate that when I think of those routes, I think of fuel. And if you could cut back fuel and the emissions that result from that fuel, you're already on a sustainable option going the Suez Canal route as opposed to going through longer routes. But the having more local manufacturing and local shipping is sort of something we maybe experience. I don't know if you're familiar with organic, eating organic, trying to support local producers and local farmers, local manufacturers. So what applies to what we eat and drink is equally as applicable to the stuff that we buy as well. But if we were to change these manufacturing centers around the world, absolutely there will be tension that is caused when you do that. But overall, it'll be more equitable so that there are others that could rise to that, have more employment in countries or cities that don't already have that. So perhaps it's the tension that precedes having more equity and a more fair distribution of employment and income.
So do you envisage, I'm pushing on this point a little bit, but would you envisage a realignment or a redistribution of manufacturing centers? So those things that are needed in the West, for example, will get manufactured in the West, and those or closer to the West, to be more realistic, and those that needed to be consumed by the East or developing countries, but now are being manufactured in the West, should also move to a manufacturing center closer to the West. Would this be a much bigger economic upheaval, in your opinion, to achieve? And I can see you're seeking less focus, perhaps, on fuel consumption, making the route more sustainable, than going for my sort of dreamt up option, which is the restructuring or the reallocation of manufacturing centers.
I'm going to say a personal opinion here. So stepping sort of outside my expertise when it comes to manufacturing and shipping, I would say the utopia of having it all equally distributed and having resources supplied to where they belong, I think it is fair. But this goes back to, well, how do we ensure that all countries have access to the same resources? Countries have different endowments of minerals and fuel and resources, but it's not equally distributed. You've got fuel in some parts, sort of oil in some parts of the world and not in others. You go out farming in one part of the world, but not in others. So I think that globalization of that moving around makes life more comfortable, makes societies more affluent when you can afford that. But I think our current norm does not work. And I think we have a second chance to rethink that distribution, to rethink that. And in my opinion, we got to see that imagining a new norm. It started with a pandemic. The Suez Canal was almost our second chance to say, our current norm does not work. How can we make it better? And sometimes I wonder, why do I get cotton t-shirts from China when I can live in Egypt and get cotton T-shirts from Egypt? And I think, no matter how much we question it, sometimes it comes down to the economics of it, which, wearing a sustainability lens, it shouldn't be the only metric we look at, but there's labor, and there's employment, and there's work conditions to consider. So I'll say it's just this complicated fabric of issues. But I think if we always take a step back and look at the bigger picture, and if the bigger picture is sustainable consumption and sustainable manufacturing, sustainable shipping, I think it makes it clear what needs to be done, but it's a longer path to actually get there. It won't be an overnight change, but it might take time to get us there.
Okay, thank you, Nadine. I can talk to you for the rest of the session, but I think we promised our audience some questions. So I hope you will agree to take some of those questions.
Absolutely. And you opened up many, many topics. So I hope the questions that come in are equally as challenging.
Yeah, there is one from my colleague, Dania, who is behind the scenes, and she's saying, looking at sustainability from 3 perspectives, do you think remote working helps positively?
Oh, remote working and remote teaching has not been kind to 24 hours a day, because it almost feels like we need more than 24 hours a day to fit it all in. But I think one of the positivity here is that I can have this meeting with you without the need to travel all the way to you. It is positive in the sense that I click a button and I'm on and we're talking, completely bypassing airports and airplanes and jet fuel to get to you. So I think that's one of the positivities of COVID. A lot of our international students didn't have the need to return back to campus because they could still continue learning while in their home countries until the pandemic clears the way for them to return. And I think positively as well, everything is accessible. And from that perspective, I would say sustainable. There's a lot of negativity around working remotely, but we'll stick to the positives right now.
Okay, I wonder if we have another questions, and that's from one of our alumni students, Martina. Hello, Martina. It says, for us, project manager, is there a way to influence clients' decision to be more sustainable from the very beginning?
I think, thanks, Martina, for this question. Influencing is such a noble goal, to be able to have the ability to influence someone's opinion, someone's decision, someone's actions. And I think it's so intangible how we do that. But when it comes to a lot of clients, they have the bottom line to contend with, and their bottom line is usually cost, or they might have a triple bottom line. And that's when sustainability is involved as well. And finding a common ground between what we try to achieve versus clients' expectations, I think it's very hard to find that common ground so that we would at least agree on something and take it from there to try to influence other decisions as well. And I think it's tricky to try to find what's common so that we can, build from that foundation. But I think it's worth exploring that. And I think more knowledge of the client, more knowledge of their vision, more knowledge of sort of their long-term goals helps us narrow down sort of finding that common ground so that you can influence their expectations at the very beginning of projects, not at the very end, so that you can also have them on board with what you plan on achieving. I hope that kind of helps a little bit in response to that question.
I hope that helps. I think another one from Wanya, and then a question for you. Project managers usually gets involved later. I'm not sure where the echoing is coming from. Is that better? Okay. Project manager usually gets involved later after the budget and the success criteria have been decided. How can project manager influence and maybe enforce sustainability?
Okay. Now we're moving from influencing to enforcing. And I think, Walaa, you mentioned it earlier. One of your news pieces was these green bonds. And so sometimes having regulations in place that you must meet or you must abide with, having some financial regulations as well. You cannot achieve a certain loan or a grant before satisfying certain conditions. I think this goes a long way to having that enforcement as opposed to just nicely influencing. And I think there's a lot of initiatives like that in terms of opening up doors that are only possible if you have participation with Indigenous communities, or you have a certain number of diversity of the workforce, or, for example, have a little bit of the corporate responsibility management CRM, corporate responsible management projects. And so I think that's a way to enforce it. And therefore, the project manager doesn't feel the need to be obligated to do that enforcement themselves, but it's kind of coming from a different approach where the regulations are in place.
Okay. Thank you, Nadine. I actually have a bit of time for one more topic, which is okay. So let's better answer. Okay, so we've got. I
was actually going to
through my topic and answer Andrea's question. So Andrea is one of our students, and she's saying, "Hi. I said, in your career, what sustainable projects have you worked on, and what difference did it make to the local and national community of the country you worked on?" Perhaps if you give us sort of more of an insight of your African projects.
Absolutely, yes. I will mention my very first project, and I will mention the project that is very near and dear to my heart, okay? So the very first project that I worked on in Cairo was waste management in the informal sector. So the informal sector is where you don't have companies actually picking up, collecting, source separating, and recycling the waste, but rather it's informal. It's families that have grown to take this as their trade and their profession. And it was funded by a German fund to try to privatize that process and trying to see how is it that these families collect the waste. And through that discovery, it was realized that families collect waste, they bring it to their homes, the women and the children separate and source segregate the different types of waste. They're then collected in the various waste categories, and these informal groups have the ability to even have contracts with countries like China to export some of the plastics or the metals or the textiles that could be recycled. So I think this was one of my very first projects that I worked on. So this is back in 2003, and the first one when it comes to international projects. Another one that's very close to my heart is the Grand Egyptian Museum that was funded by the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, JBIC. And it was a relocation of the museum, but also factoring in the current conditions of the social fabric of that area that is being relocated to. Now, because it was a Japanese fund, it was very compartmentalized in the way they look at things, because that's just the way that the financing was and the reporting on this project. And so there was an environmental impact assessment that was done in transforming the museum from the downtown Cairo to the outskirts of the city to see some of the environmental implications of that move, but also a social impact assessment, because the society or the conditions of that local area downtown Cairo was very different than the local conditions surrounding the pyramids, where the current new location of the museum. And there's a lot of people that earn a livelihood in that area. And to bring in a whole museum might either disrupt it or might improve their work conditions. So I think keeping both of these projects sort of as a demonstration of sustainability was very enlightening, because they were both very new to me when I embarked on these projects, but also recognizing the German fund and the Japanese fund as well.
That's really very good. And that sort of brings also that you're saying the stakeholder, the funder as a stakeholder may have some kind of an impact on the way we conduct our projects. I think we've got questions from Nito Lambro, who I believe is our colleague Nicholas Lambro, but I didn't know that his nickname is Nito. But anyway, here you go. Hello, Nick, or Nito. Okay. His question is that, do you think the Glasgow Climate Summit will be a success? or is there any KPIs that you can suggest to the politicians?
Thanks, Nito, for this. I haven't been following the sort of the agenda of the Glasgow Climate Summit, but I would say all climate summits are a success in bringing people together. The success of what results from bringing people together is very questionable, because a lot of sitting and a lot of talking doesn't result in much action. So I think if I can suggest some KPIs to the politicians, is to commit to funding, to commit to projects, and to do that with a long-term goal. Because so far in a lot of the climate summits, and the ones that I follow specifically are the UNFCCC ones, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which takes place annually. That's, I think, the one that I follow more closely. And when it comes to that, there's a lot of talk, and they sign a lot of things. And every time they push their targets out for another 5 years, and then they push it out another 5 years or 10 years. So I think now is the time to actually commit the financing, but it's such a difficult time when a lot of these countries are actually trying to bounce back and recover from what the pandemic has caused. So it's a tough one. It's usually not a tough one to commit the financing that they promised they would, but it's tough, particularly this year, because of recovering from the pandemic and resuming the economic prosperity from back sort of March 2020, which is when everything was disrupted again.
I've been getting messages from my production manager, our production manager should say, Danya, saying that we have to finish in 2 minutes. But I've got one last question, and you can have 60 seconds to answer it, which is there an ideological dimension to this sustainability? Do people in developing countries feel that actually, here we go again, the West is suddenly bringing a new agenda called the green agenda, and before it was the industrialization agenda, and after that was the globalization agenda, and now we have the green agenda. Do they have the right to be a little bit wary of that, or maybe they should engage with it more forcefully or anything else? I think I've been pointed at 60 seconds for you to answer.
Okay, here we go. Absolutely, they should be wary. We are wary ourselves. We don't have to be in sub-Saharan Africa to think, here we go again, another framework and another convention and another target. But I think, drawing from sub-Saharan Africa specifically in your question, they don't need to borrow best practices from the West. They will develop their own best practices, because the best practices of the West or the global North did not work. It resulted in the climate emissions that we face today. It resulted in this overconsumptive behaviors that we have today. And I think to them, that's sort of a green light that they don't have to borrow these best practices, can make their own and chart their own sustainable path without having to engage in yet another framework. But there is power in numbers. So engaging collectively in at least the Sustainable Development Goals would be a positive way forward.
Nadine, and on the word collectively, I must say that we collectively would love and like to thank you very much for this engaging and exciting, really, talk. And again, we hope that we will try to get some of your time one more time, not in the very long future. Nadine, thank you very, very much for your time.
Thank you, Walaa. It has been absolutely wonderful. The questions were absolutely inspiring, and it's a great start to my morning, which is just getting going.
That's it, yeah. And it's a good time for me. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.